All right, female sexual maturity is our next topic. So, where to begin here? Female sexual maturity. So, I guess we start with the brain again. Just like in the males, at a certain point, the brain is like, you're ready to start being a woman. It's time for you to be a woman. And the hypothalamus, then, same thing, starts producing gonadotropic releasing hormone. That gonadotropic releasing hormone travels down the portal vein to the anterior pituitary, and the cells of the anterior pituitary start making luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Just as we did, the same thing as we had in men. Exact same thing. Same. Except now things are a little bit different because follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone don't go to the testes because there are no testes. They go to the female anatomy. They head for the ovaries. Interestingly enough, luteinizing hormone also stimulates a little bit of testosterone production in the adrenal glands. But mainly what's going to start happening is luteinizing hormone is going to promote the release of two hormones from the ovaries. One of them is estrogen. And so estrogen is the primary hormone of it's the testosterone of females. And its structure similar, similar kind of hormone. And it does similar things. It goes to the tissues of the body. Now, a woman will enter puberty when estrogen is in the body. And so what happens is pubic hair, just like we had with testosterone. Breasts start to grow, the tissue around the breast. So there's some differences here. Breasts start to grow. The skeleton starts to grow in a different way than it does for men, especially around the pelvis. The skeleton changes shape around the pelvis. Is so that it widens, so that because a woman will have to pass a baby through that part of her skeleton. Fat distribution and hair distribution change. More women have a little bit more fat than men do, percentage body-wise of fat. The uterus and the vagina grow. And like I said, the bones, the pelvis starts to grow. Progesterone, the other hormone, what it does is it promotes changes in breast tissue. So basically making ready for the mammary glands so that women can produce milk, would be able to produce milk. And these hormones have just like testosterone, have a negative feedback on the hypothalamus, a negative feedback on gonadotropic releasing hormone, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So that is, the levels are steady, except there is a difference. So estrogen and progesterone, if estrogen levels reach a certain threshold, so they have a negative feedback, but they're being slowed down. But if there's too much of them, the negative feedback will switch to a positive feedback. And so now, instead of reducing the levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, especially luteinizing hormone will spike, will go up. And we're going to encounter this in the menstrual cycle, which we're going to talk about in this unit. So luteinizing hormone is releasing estrogen and progesterone, which have a negative feedback onto luteinizing hormone until they get to a certain level. It's kind of hard to wrap your brain around this. So they have a negative feedback, but then if there's too much of estrogen, they switch to a positive feedback for luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone, what it does, remember in men, follicle stimulating hormone, what it did is it began spermatogenesis, so the generating of sperm. Here, all a woman's gonads, all of the eggs are already made. They were made in a woman's embryonic stage when she was an embryo, when she was a fetus. They were all made, but they were all stopped. Their development stopped at meiosis 1. FSH is now released, and what happens is, so this is the beginning, this is the start of puberty, and what happens is now we also start the monthly menstrual cycle. That's what FSH kind of does, is it triggers that. And so what happens is it's called follicle stimulating hormone, not because it starts spermatogenesis in men, but because it reactivates meiosis in those primary oocytes. So they've been sleeping all this time for however many years, while a woman was growing as a child, and now meiosis restarts. And the first thing that happens is meiosis 2 happens, so 46 chromosomes go to 23 chromosomes, and that primary oocyte divides in 2. Interestingly, here it divides in 2, but it's an asymmetrical division. So what happens is that primary oocyte that's been sitting dormant divides in 2, except one of them gets all the cytoplasm from the other one. So the other one just gets 23 random chromosomes and nothing else. And the other guy, one, these are called, they become ovum, I guess. They're not ovum yet. Well, yeah, okay, fine, let's just call them ovum. They're going to be ovum. It divides and it keeps all of the cytoplasm. Now, the reason for that is because this ovum might get fertilized. And when it gets fertilized, it's going to be in the fallopian tube. It's going to be fertilized. And when it gets fertilized, it's going to turn into a zygote, and it's going to have to divide. It's going to have to do a lot of cell division. And as a result, it's going to need huge amounts of resources. It's going to have to survive on its own until it embeds in the endometrium of the uterus. It's going to have to survive on its own. So by taking that extra cytoplasm, you're getting all of the, all of the extra mitochondria, all the extra stuff, and you're better equipped to survive, to do all of that dividing. So it's like it's taking all, that other, what happens to the other one, that other one is called the polar body, and it just disintegrates. Do we have a good, can I show you this? No. It's the same thing again. No. We must have something. We must have polar body. There. This. Primordial follicles. Secondary follicle. No, this is just follicles. Meow. We don't have a good picture of it. Oh no, we do. There it is. There it is. So, primordial germ cell, this is in the embryo, oogonium, primary oocyte. So this is where we stopped. And so the ovaries are full of these. These are all the eggs that you're ever going to get are stored as primary oocytes in the ovum. And then once a month, what happens is follicle stimulating hormones activate a few of these, actually, primary oocytes to start meiosis 2, where they divide, and see here they're diploid, they're 2N, they have 46 chromosomes, and now they have 23 chromosomes, and see after that first division, this guy's called the first polar body. It's just all the cytoplasm from this guy went to this guy, the secondary oocyte. And so this guy disintegrates, done. And then we do meiosis 2, we continue, and even more cytoplasm, a second polar body goes. And now this is the ovum, and it is ready to be fertilized, and is ready, and it's got enough cytoplasm, enough resources where it will be able to produce a zygote. Whereas remember, in sperm, you just made 4 sperm. With all the meiotic divisions, you just made 4 sperm, and they were all equal. Here, it's you make a polar body which just disintegrate and an ovum, one ovum. And like I said, from that primary oocyte, so those things that were being stored since the woman was an embryo, a few of them become activated every month, but only one of them will mature to become an ovum that that is ready for fertilization. The other ones don't make it. I think they get reabsorbed. Yeah. Okay, so FSH, luteinizing hormone. Here we go. So what happens? So let's talk about the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle is actually 2 cycles running together, and they're influenced kind of by each other. One is the ovarian cycle, so that's what's happening inside the ovaries. And one is the uterine cycle, so what's happening in the uterus. And basically, the goal for the ovarian cycle is to make an ovary, so an egg that is ready to be fertilized. And the goal for the uterine cycle is to prepare the uterus and get it ready for pregnancy so that a baby can develop inside the uterus. The lining of the uterus eventually becomes the placenta. We talked about the placenta will become the placenta. So lots of important stuff has to happen in the uterus, and it has to be ready if a fertilized egg makes it. If the egg doesn't get fertilized, everything resets. And the uterus resets, you have menstruation, all the stuff that it makes gets dumped. That's not a very sciencey, delicate way of putting it. I don't have a better word. It's just not. I don't have it today. And the ovary resets and is ready to go again. Another primary oocyte is ready to come forward to continue meiosis, and this happens every month. So let's talk about the ovarian cycle. What happens in the ovarian cycle? So and both of these cycles are influenced and controlled by hormones. So here we go. Let's talk about the ovaries, the ovarian cycle. So we start with a primary oocyte. Where is the primary oocyte? And what happens is FSH from the anterior pituitary promotes the maturation of a follicle. And so here we go. So that follicle will start to undergo, and remember the follicle, so the primary oocyte is the egg, is the gonad, and then the follicle is also the cells that are around it. So an egg comes with cells that are around it, and those cells are helping the egg. They're directing and they're nourishing and they're helping the egg. So what happens is that primary oocyte divides into a secondary oocyte. Remember that there it is, a secondary oocyte. The first polar body the cytoplasm gets absorbed, and then that happens again. So you get a secondary polar body and an ovum. Meanwhile, the follicular tissue is growing and getting bigger, and then what happens is the follicle fuses to the wall of the ovary. It fuses to the wall of the ovary. Is there a cool picture of that sort of thing? No. Well, this is kind of a one. So here is, can we zoom in? That's kind of cool. So here is those primary oocytes. You can see the follicular cells are dividing. They're becoming larger and larger. There's that primary oocyte is undergoing the stages of meiosis. The polar bodies get reabsorbed, and then it gets, so we're going this way sort of time, and then it gets attached to the wall here of the follicular cells attach it to the wall of the ovary. There's the ovum, and there's a microscope image of that. Look at that. There's the follicular cells. There's the ovum. And then what happens? So meanwhile, FSH. So you've been releasing FSH and lutein and LH, luteinizing hormone. Let's go back down here. FSH and luteinizing hormone. So that's the day that first thing that I just told you about until it attaches to the wall of the ovary. When it's mature and it's attached to the wall of the ovary is called a Graafian follicle, and that whole day 1 to day 13 is called the follicular phase. FSH, anterior pituitary follicle, and what happens is the follicle, meanwhile, while it's maturing in these day 1 to 3, is actually secreting estrogen and progesterone, which in turn inhibits luteinizing hormone and FSH. While that's happening, that progesterone is stimulating the uterus. So that other cycle that I told you about, we're going to be talking about in a second, is being run by the follicle cells, which are secreting progesterone. So the two cycles run together and they influence each other. Now, the estrogen in levels, they lower FSH. Now, what happens here, and it's sort of weird, is there's even though the production of estrogen, it gets reduced, there's still more and more that estrogen, the levels of estrogen still go up. I don't know. And they reach a threshold anyways, because it's still being made. Even though it's being made less and less and less and less, it's still being made. It's sort of being slowed down. It's still being made. So, and it just reaches a level where it now switches from inhibiting the hypothalamus from producing GnRH into the gonadotropic releasing hormone, to it switches to promoting it. So it switches to a positive feedback. And all of a sudden, what you end up having is more gonadotropic releasing hormone, and so the anterior pituitary starts producing a lot more luteinizing hormone and to a certain degree follicle stimulating hormone. But what's really important is the luteinizing hormone. That hormone builds up, and what the luteinizing hormone does is it stimulates the follicle to push, to burst, and shoot the ovum out of the ovary. Yep, that's right. It fires it out like the fluid here pushes it out. There's more images of it. There we go. There's an image of it being shot out. Where is there another one? Here's another one. The follicle shoots it out. And that's called ovulation. So that happens on day 14. Now, it doesn't exactly happen on day 14. That's an average. So day 1 to day 30 is a follicular. The follicle is maturing. On day 14, it's mature. It's called a Graafian follicle, and it's at the wall of the ovary. And on day 14, the luteinizing hormone spikes because the levels of estrogen reach that threshold where it's instead of inhibiting the production of luteinizing hormone, it promotes the production of luteinizing hormone. A feedback loop is very fast because remember that luteinizing hormone causes more estrogen to be produced, which causes more luteinizing hormone, and it spikes, and that estrogen bursts, and that causes the wall of the ovary to burst, the follicle to burst, and the ovum and some of the follicular cells shoots out, and it flies across the gap into the opening of the fallopian tube, and it's helped by those fimbriae, those fingers that are on the opening of the fallopian tube. They sort of pulse back and forth, and so any fluid that's there is pushed or kind of gently pushed into the fallopian tube, and so the egg floats along into the fallopian tube. Remember, the egg doesn't have a flagellum like sperm does. It just is just at the mercy of the fluids and stuff around it. And then inside the fallopian tube, there are cilia that help the egg along and move it towards the uterus. But we're not done with the ovarian cycle yet. We're not done with it. Because even though the ovum is gone, those follicular cells are still there. And after a couple of days, they sort of transform, they come together, and they turn into what's called the corpus luteum. So those follicular cells turn into, they're in the ones that are left behind in the ovary, turn into the corpus luteum, and they start back up making progesterone and estrogen. So after day 14, so day 15 to 28, the end of the cycle, it's called the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. And that is just the corpus luteum pumping out estrogen and progesterone. And estrogen and progesterone, what they're doing is they are going to the uterus and doing stuff in the uterine cycle, which we're going to talk about in about a second. At the end of that 28 days, so after about 10 days, 13 days, the corpus luteum shuts down and just disintegrates and is done. And stops producing estrogen and progesterone after about 10 days. So estrogen and progesterone levels start to drop because that's the thing that's been producing progesterone and estrogen. Okay, so now the uterine cycle, which is happening concurrently at the same time as the ovarian cycle, what happens there? Well, what happens there is, so if we start when the corpus luteum dies or fade, it doesn't die, it just stops doing its thing and gets absorbed, it disintegrates. Estrogen and progesterone levels drop. And they drop, and when they drop, the inner lining of the uterus resets. And that's menstruation. So I guess we start in menstruation. So the inner lining of the uterus is being cleaned out. It's being reset to start again. So the first 5 days of the uterine cycle is called the menstrual phase. And it lasts 5 days, and it's when progesterone and estrogen levels are low. Now, when progesterone and estrogen levels are low and they drop low, that tells the hypothalamus, hey, I got to make gonadotropic releasing hormone. And it makes gonadotropic releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to make luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, they start the follicle maturing. Remember, in the ovarian cycle, that's the follicular phase. And as soon as the follicle starts maturing, it starts making estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone in the uterine cycle start at day 6, basically, the proliferative phase. And what happens there, so the maturing follicle is making progesterone and estrogen, is the endometrium lining is being rebuilt and thickening. So remember, the uterus is 2 layers. The outside layer is that mucosa, the muscle layer, and the inner layer is the endometrium, which is the layer that can change in thickness. And so what's happening is in the proliferative phase, the endometrium is growing capillaries, blood vessels, and is thickening. It's growing thicker and thicker. It's getting ready for a baby. So it's getting ready to also to turn into the placenta. There we go. Just went blank there for a second. Then what happens is on day 14, ovulation happens. When ovulation happens and the ovum bursts out and it goes into the fallopian tube, the corpus, the follicle cells sort of stop doing anything. So estrogen levels and progesterone levels drop, but then they pick back up because the corpus luteum, I guess, and we had a big spike there of estrogen. So on day 14, we have a huge spike of estrogen. Sorry, we have this massive spike because the luteinizing hormone made a big spike. And so we have a spike in estrogen, which then we have the ovulation. The corpus luteum continues secreting estrogen and progesterone. But the uterus now is sort of at the size that it wants to be, and so it switches to what's called the secretory phase, where it just secretes mucus and the glands of the uterus. So what happens is it's going, when you're pregnant, the uterus is going to start secreting estrogen as well, and or progesterone, and so it's developing now secretory glands, and that's day 15 to 28. If there's no fertilization, no implantation, then what happens is the corpus luteum disintegrates, estrogen and progesterone levels drop, the uterine lining then stops doing what it was doing, stops growing, stops getting ready for a baby, and we switch to the menstrual phase, and out it goes. So the ovarian cycle affects the uterine cycle. Okay. There's a nice, I guess this is pretty nice because it shows both of them at the same time. So we have menstruation, we have the follicle, so FSH is affecting here, making the follicle, which is producing estrogen, which starts the proliferative phase of the uterus, and it's growing. Here we've got ovulation, and then progesterone and estrogen is made by the corpus luteum, which maintains the lining of the uterus. But then no fertilization, corpus luteum disintegrates, menstruation occurs, and reset. And here's the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. Right? It's called the luteal phase. Yes, it is. And here are all the levels of all the different hormones. So FSH. This is the follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. So the corpus luteum produces progesterone. So there you go. That's progesterone rising from the corpus luteum. The follicle does not. So it's only after ovulation that you start to get more progesterone. There's the level of estrogen. The follicle's producing estrogen as it's maturing, more and more estrogen, and it reaches wherever that threshold level is. So you could see that as the levels of estrogen rise, FSH is going down, LH is going down because they're being inhibited. But then at a certain point, instead of being inhibited, they're being promoted. So it switches. How confusing is that? There you go. And that cycle repeats for a woman until she enters menopause. And at menopause, menstruation stops. Hormone levels go awry, and menstruation stops. So women stop menstruating at a certain point. Usually that age is, it can really vary. But it's usually like in later midlife, around there. But women can have children well into their 40s. Well into their 40s can women have children. So there you go. And there's like a big, there is a sort of mean thing. If you're pregnant, you're a woman and you're pregnant after the age of 35, they call that a geriatric pregnancy. I don't know where that comes from because my wife was pregnant after she was 35. And you just do extra testing, basically for concerns for the mother. So there you go. That is female sexual maturity. There's a lot of stuff going on there. So have a look at that, review all those things. Awesome.